Let's continue to preview Cincinnati Bengals training camp by getting into all of the questions, and there are quite a few facing this offense.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals, covering your team every day on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. Shout out to the everydayers. Appreciate you for making the Locked On Bengals podcast part of your routine, and all of you who make us your first listen. Shout outs as well. Today's episode, where we will continue to preview Cincinnati Bengals training camp with the things we will be watching and the stories we will be tracking on the offensive side of the ball, is brought to you by FanDuel, which is a place where you can make every moment more. They've got all customers getting a daily bonus or boost all summer. Check it out at FanDuel.com to get started. And James, when you think about the Cincinnati Bengals offense, obviously you think about Joe Burrow. Very shortly after you think about Joe Burrow, you think about Ja'Marr Chase. Very shortly after you think about Ja'Marr Chase, you think about T. Higgins. And this year, there's the added fun, at training camp anyway, you could call it fun, of a wide receiver 3 battle. But this offense starts with this quarterback and goes through its receivers first and foremost. We'll talk about the offensive line, obviously, as well, and whether they've done the things they needed to do to get that unit where it needs to be a Super Bowl team. But the identity of this offense for the last few years, in my mind, has largely been around those 3 guys: Joe Burrow, Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins, leading the way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the identity of this offense. And if this team is going to win the division again, have the success it wants to in the playoffs, make a run towards the Super Bowl, well, guess what? Guess what's going to have to happen? Joe Burrow, Ja'Marr Chase, and T. Higgins are going to have to lead the way. They are. And I think that's sort of the beauty in what the Bengals have done. And I think it's more indirect than direct, because whether or not Ja'Marr Chase gets an extension done, T. Higgins, we know that's not happening. Talked about it on Sunday's show or Monday's show. And then Joe Burrow coming back from the wrist. All 3 of these guys either have something to earn, prove, or a little bit of both. And Ja'Marr wants to show that he's better than Justin Jefferson. Joe Burrow wants to reestablish himself and show everyone that he's still the man when it comes to quarterback play outside of Patrick Mahomes. And T. Higgins is playing for a huge contract. So all these guys, not that they were never not motivated, but they have every reason to be motivated because there's a potential ring on the line, but also from a financial standpoint, whether or not Ja'Marr gets done, who knows? But I think they have that as well. But to your point, yeah, they are the straw that stirs the drink. In my opinion, you could have went with this trio as the face of the franchise. And instead, I think that the Bengals are going in another direction, at least with T, long-term, but short-term, certainly a huge, huge part of what they do.
And will be a big determining factor in the success of the offense this year. And a big determining factor when they've been good in the past has been the success of Joe Burrow throwing to Ja'Marr Chase and to T. Higgins. And one of the big questions this year facing the offense around the wide receiver position is who emerges at wide receiver 3, and what kind of versatility does that player offer? Do they rotate that position more than they have in the past? Is there an increased emphasis to get Ja'Marr Chase into the slot, to move him around pre-snap more? We talked about that a little bit when we talked about scheme yesterday, and it really comes into focus when you think about the receiver battle from a positional versatility perspective, from a personnel perspective, the options that the Bengals have at wide receiver 3, which will be dictated by how they play in practice, how they play in the preseason, because this will be a battle, do go hand in hand with some of the schematic elements that we would like to see the Bengals implement. Some of these players are, on paper anyway, more versatile than others. I know Charlie Jones played outside at Purdue. It's not a place where he seems to thrive in the NFL. And if he finds his way onto the field in the NFL, I think it will be because he's figured out the slot position. Meanwhile, Andre Yosevich, who was very impressive in the offseason program and had a better than expected rookie season, isn't really working in the slot at all. So if he's going to get onto the field, does that mean Jamar Chase is working in the slot on those plays? And the other exciting player in that mix, not to take anything away from Trenton Irwin, but I think we can agree that Jermaine Burton has a little bit more excitement around him as a shiny new thing in the third round receiver who could have been picked earlier if not for some questions off the field going into the draft. Has that versatility where he in the offseason program was lining up a little bit all over the place, leads to a very intriguing battle for wide receiver 3.
Yeah, I agree. I think when it comes to position battles and storylines, wide receiver 3 is above all of the other ones for me. Not that it's the highest importance. You could argue cornerback, and we'll talk about cornerback on tomorrow's show. But the impact that it could have on the scheme stuff and the ripple effect it could have throughout the offense. If Jermaine Burton can emerge as this quality slot receiver, and what I mean by that is have the Tyler Boydisms down, where he has the Joe Burrow's trust on the choice routes and has his trust on 3rd and 6, as well as the ability to stretch the field, all of the things there. Or is that Charlie Jones that emerges? Or is it Mike Gesicki, who we'll get into coming up? Like, I think that the wide receiver 3 wrinkle, and in Gesicki's case, he's not even a receiver, but how they figure that out, how they deploy it is really, really interesting. And maybe it is Yoshi. Maybe Andre Yosavash is so good that they're like, all right, well, we're going to get Jamar in the slot a ton, and he gives us that explosive slot, and we can use him in a bunch of different ways and maximize him still. And at the same time, we have a guy in Andre Yosavash opposite T. Higgins, who would be an elite athlete that can get downfield and can make plays. I don't know if that'll happen, but I certainly think there's a world where that happens, where he establishes himself as that. And because of Jamar Chase's versatility, he could certainly find his way onto the field. So yeah, that wide receiver 3 battle, it's interesting because it could have a real impact on how the offense looks. And we've talked a lot about scheme and things like that. Well, the offense could change based on who's out there, who earns those reps.
And we're going to talk about running backs by committee and tight ends by committee, where they have all this depth. Well, at tight end, they have a lot of depth. At running back, they have 2 players that we think they want to get on the field quite a bit in Chase Brown and Zack Moss. We'll talk about that later in the show. For those watching on YouTube, you already see that is a topic that we plan to cover. But I think we probably are going to be talking about wide receiver 3 by committee to at least some degree. And you just kind of mentioned why. Jermaine Burton is going to get onto the field at some point this year. Maybe not every snap kind of stuff, unless he really runs away with things. But between him, Mike Gesicki, Charlie Jones, and Andre Yosavash, I think this coaching staff is going to want to use each of those guys in different ways at different times throughout this season. And depending on what it is that they're trying to accomplish in a specific game plan on a specific play, I don't know why we wouldn't be looking at wide receiver 3 by committee the way we're thinking about tight end by committee, because of the different strengths and weaknesses of each player and what they allow you to do on offense when they're on the field.
Yeah. Yep. I think the committee is a very fair expectation. It's reasonable because of a few factors. One, I think it's unreasonable to expect Jermaine Burton to just come in and be that guy that plays 80% of the snaps. It's a lot to ask. It just is. At the same time, and I do think he's being overlooked a bit, Trenton Irwin has that trust. I think he's going to be firmly in the mix there. Could Charlie Jones earn slot snaps? Absolutely. I mentioned the Andre Yosavash path to the field. And so there's all these different guys that are battling. And the beauty of it is, if one goes down or one gets nicked up, and one likely will, you should still be able to run your stuff. You might have to tweak it, but you should still be able to run your stuff at a really, really high level. And the one thing the Bengals were dependent on over the past few years is 3 receivers: Jamar, T, Tyler. And yes, Trenton Irwin had some moments, no doubt about it, some big plays. But when Tyler went down in that AFC Championship game, they didn't have another guy. And so maybe this is the path to them having multiple guys behind the big 2 in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins.
Jamar Chase still drives this wide receiver room. I know T. Higgins is a very good player. We've just had a whole offseason talking about, the franchise tag and extending him and all these things, but nobody dictates defenses on this team the way Jamar Chase does. And so that will still be the star around which they build this wide receiver room and deploy this wide receiver unit. And I use the word star both in terms of NFL superstar power and gravity, which we've talked about on this show before, that stars as celestial bodies bring with them. Coming up next, speaking of massive things that may or may not have their own gravitational pull, let's talk about this offensive line a little bit, James. It continues to get bigger. Did they continue to get better? Coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports, and I don't want them to stop, but right now we've kind of reached a few weeks where it's a little slower. You have Major League Baseball and the All-Star break. You have NFL right around the corner. Well, it's still the perfect time to get to FanDuel because FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So whether you're looking at NFL futures, whether you think that the Reds are going to turn it around in the second half of the Major League Baseball season after the All-Star break, head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. Again, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. Take advantage of this right now. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So head on over to FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer.
We talked about this recently, James. Every year we convince ourselves around this time of year in the middle of July that the Bengals have done enough this year to improve the offensive line. Pass protection is going to be the best we've seen it in the Joe Burrow era. And once again this year, right or wrong, we've largely reached the same conclusion. I'm being a little bit cynical about it here, but I'm not saying we're wrong either. And that was a point that I wanted to make clear last time we talked about this. Yes, we convince ourselves, but one of these years we're going to be right about it. And they add not only Trent Brown, but they also add Amarius Mims. They also have the benefit of continuity. Hopefully, we get to see them experience the benefit of not playing through injury, and Cordell Volson in his third year, hopefully finding the stability that he found after the first 3 games, largely last year, playing beside Orlando Brown. There aren't a lot of changes on this offensive line, but there is a really good pass protector that they added who has his own health concerns at right tackle in Trent Brown, and a all-ceiling team right tackle prospect they added Amarius Mims, where perhaps they've done enough that we can feel better about the offensive line this year, despite questions lingering for interior offensive line depth that we've also discussed recently.
It's funny because where the bar, it's funny or sad or both, whatever, where the bar started in 2020, I think they have gotten better.
Or even after the Super Bowl in 2021.
Well, then it's really gotten better. It has, because it was awful in 21 too. Yes, no doubt. But like adding Riley Reif made them better. Jackson Carman didn't, but Riley Reif did. And then the year after that, you get Ted Karras, you get Alex Kappa, you get Lyle Collins, who helped them when he was out there. He just got hurt at the end. And so even last year, like when they were winning games down the stretch with Jake Browning, I thought the offensive line was playing pretty darn good at times.
It was.
Not great, but they were playing pretty darn good at times. So if you're getting that unit, okay. Plus you added Trent Brown, who is a great fit, as you mentioned, great fit from a pass protection standpoint. Okay, well, he's often injured. That's fine. You took Amarius Mims, who has been on Orlando Brown Jr.'s hip in a good way, learning everything, soaking it all in from Orlando Brown Jr., the way he carries himself, the work ethic, all of those things. That's what you want, because you want those two guys to hold down the fort at these spots. Maybe this year, maybe Mims pushes for that. But regardless, I do think that they're 6 deep is fair to say because of Mims or Brown or whoever is on the outside looking in. And there are questions about Volson. You could certainly wonder about Kappa and his inconsistency last year. I think he's going to bounce back in a big way and be more consistent. Orlando Brown Jr. was battling the groin, but he's been pretty consistent throughout his career. I think we know what he's going to be when he's healthy. And so I like this offensive line. I do think that they have the potential to be a top 10 unit, and I think that's where their expectations should be. And I think it's fair for us to view them that way going into this year. And I don't think I've said that before during this offensive line revamp. I do think that they're that much better, at least on paper, because you have the first round talent in Amarius Mims. You bring back your core four, essentially, your four other guys, your four other starters. You have Brown. You get your guy, Matt Lee. So there's even a little depth there. Would I like a little more? Of course. Of course. Hopefully they sign someone before this episode airs and make both of us eat our words. But I do like the direction that they're headed in, and they should be pretty darn good.
And we did a full episode going really in depth on these offensive line players with Brandon Thorne back in May. That was on May 8th. So if you're looking for more offensive line talk, because we're only spending one segment on it here, and you want to hear us talk about them for a full 33-minute show, well, that's out there if you go back in time a little bit on YouTube. It was a really good episode. So if you missed that one in May because it was the off season, good time to go back and review it. And while we're bullish, I think, on the potential of this starting unit, and you said top 10, I think in the past we've talked about if they can be an average unit, we'd be pretty happy. If they can be a top half unit, we'd be pretty happy. I don't know if I'm ready to say top 10, not because I think that they're necessarily 10 better offensive lines in the NFL, just because that feels, because of what we've been through, so lofty, you know? Like, let's make it a little bit easier. Let's just say top 12.
Top 12, fine. Top 12.
Just to make it feel more attainable, just on vibes alone. Not saying anything analytical about this, but just on vibes. 12 feels more doable to me, you know?
By the way, if they're 12th, that offense is going to be humming.
We're still pretty happy about it, right?
That offense is going to be humming. No doubt.
Now,
no doubt about it.
If they're like a top 5 pass protecting offensive line, we're ecstatic. Like that's where
then Burrow's winning a few trophies. He's winning a few trophies this year if that happens.
And part of that means that they've stayed healthy, or Amarius Mims is ready to go right away, because everyone's projecting that Trent Brown's going to miss some time this year. Everyone, I think, have the expectation. I'll speak for myself only instead of other people. Have the expectation that at some point there's a likelihood that Trent Brown can miss some time. And we talked recently about the depth, where we're trying to identify right now who we think the 8 guys active on game day would be on the offensive line. You got the 5 starters plus Mims, Cody Ford seem like the obvious 7, and then is trying to find that 8th guy. Is it a Jackson Kirkland? Is it a Trey Hill? Is Jackson Carman even in the conversation? Are we talking about Matt Lee as a center-only backup as a rookie 7th round pick, where we thought the reason he fell into the 7th round was because he was a center-only prospect? Is there someone else that emerges and surprises us and forces their way onto the roster and then onto the game day active list? That last piece, while maybe it shouldn't feel as concerning as it does right now, that swing interior offensive lineman who can back up center and guard, they're probably pretty happy with Cody Ford being the backup guard right now. I think they're higher on Cody Ford than I am personally, and think that he's a great 6th, 7th lineman to have. But that last guy is still a question. And it doesn't necessarily feel like they're going to sign someone, even though both of us, I think, would welcome the veteran addition. If this is who they run with, that will be a question that we continue to look for answers for throughout camp, throughout the preseason, as we're looking for how are those backup interior offensive linemen performing? And is one of them able to play center and guard?
Yeah.
And that question will linger.
It will. And that's honestly where Trey Hill, this is your chance. Like if there was ever a chance for you to make the leap, take the step, establish yourself as a key backup piece of the future, the time is now. I just don't know if that's realistic to expect. And so, yeah, I was surprised in the draft that they didn't address it multiple times. Felt like they would have, or they could have, and they didn't. They get Matt Lee, who we both like as a center. I don't think you're playing him as a guard. Like, is he adding weight? Is he going the Ted Karras route where he adds enough weight where he can do it? I don't know. Ted will certainly be able to show him how he keeps the weight on, puts the weight on, or did in the past at least to keep it on. But I think that's a bit unrealistic too. So I agree that's the question, and they might be banking on Cody Ford. I don't think they're banking on Jackson Carman or Deontay Smith. Now, if one of those guys emerge, great. But if you're Carman, by the way, be willing to play guard, be willing to show that you can do a bunch. I don't think I'll ever be able to play center, so it doesn't entirely line up with what you're saying. But yeah, I think a lot of these guys that have been on the roster are now on the bubble. In past years on the roster are now on the bubble, and it'll be interesting to see who makes the cut.
They are all also in the final year of their deal, so one way or another, there will likely be some changes coming in the future for the Cincinnati Bengals backup offensive line personnel. But we're not talking about that distant of a future quite yet. We're talking about next week's future, where we will continue to get some answers about the tight end by committee group. Well, we see these rookies early in camp. When will they be ready? And the running backs, as we continue to try to find out how exactly Zack Moss and Chase Brown will be deployed. We'll finish up our conversation on the offense with those topics coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools that you need to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. Finding quality employees is hard. You know it, I know it, everyone knows it, and you want to make sure that you're looking in the right direction. Well, LinkedIn Jobs is going to do that for you because they're not just a job board. They help you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open for the perfect role in a given month. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats, might not have the time or resources to hire. That's why they're finding ways to make the process easier. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn, and you should too, by posting your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Couple big topics to finish up the show here, James, in the running back group and the tight end group. They are less in the spotlight in Cincinnati, I think, than perhaps on some other teams, where we just discussed the big identity factors for this team the last couple of years have been the wide receivers and the ups and downs of the offensive line, and the offensive line being blamed, I think, in many ways for the team's failings at certain points. But they're also looking for consistency at the tight end position, where they add Mike Gesicki, they retain Tanner Hudson, they draft Tanner McLaughlin and Eric All, and whether those guys are ready to go for camp, I think, is an interesting question, or whether both or one of them needs to start the year on the PUP list. And then at running back, where you've got Zack Moss, Chase Brown, and we thought they would add a guy, but behind them is still Travion Williams and Chris Evans, the same running back depth they've had with a different name. Zack Moss replacing Joe Mixon in that room. A couple of very interesting groups and interesting storylines that, in terms of volatility, things that could change over the course of training camp, I see these position groups as the ones that offer the most potential for changes because of the way things happen throughout the preseason, throughout training camp.
Sure. Especially running back, I would still be surprised if they don't, and maybe I'm just dead wrong on this, but they don't add someone. And we can talk about that. But I wonder about Eric All. Like, that's the real question mark here. I think Tanner McLaughlin health-wise is going to be fine. But Eric All is the one guy in that room that I think the Bengals feel like can develop into a do-it-all tight end, where he can give you some of what Drew Sample does, give you some of what Mike Gesicki does, or Tanner McLaughlin, or insert whoever that you're confident in. And so I think that element is quite interesting. Having him, is he the third tight end? Does he start on the PUP list? Does he join mid-year, or is he health-wise ready to go or close to ready to go to where you can start to develop him? Because of all of these guys, that looks like the long-term piece that could be the answer of an every down tight end. We know what Drew Sample is. Tanner McLaughlin doesn't really project to be an every down tight end, even though they really like him and like him as a pass catcher. So Eric All is the guy I'll be watching, because I think when you talk about upside, when you talk about where he is, maybe it isn't this year. Maybe this year ends up being a redshirt year. I hope not. But we could literally go from redshirt year to, oh man, he's contributing early and getting on the field because he can do it. There's a huge variance here for what we could see from Eric All this season.
And one of the things that we'll be talking about, I can almost guarantee you, very early next week at some point, we're obviously going to be looking at Joe Burrow and what he's doing early in camp. No question about that. T. Higgins is going to come back. We're going to talk about T. Higgins being back in the building. No question about that. But one of the topics that I think is going to come up as well is what players are ready from a health perspective. We're going to talk about the guys that end up on the PUP list to start the year, and all eyes could be on Eric Hall. And remember that the PUP list doesn't necessarily mean long-term absence in training camp. Chidobe Awuzie started the year on the PUP list last year, right? And was off it in like a day, less than a day, whatever it was very quick.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
Not to overreact or anything, but finding out what guys are ready to go at the start of camp versus what guys need a little bit of time will be interesting, especially at the tight end position where Eric Hall is potentially, if not for the injuries, a tight end that could have been picked much higher in the draft, and also is an Iowa tight end, a former Iowa tight end. I guess he, also played at Michigan, but he finished his career at Iowa. Point is, draft the helmet, not the player at the tight end position. Eric Hall, Iowa tight end, is going to be a stud in the NFL. Obviously, that's just what Iowa tight ends do. Beyond that, figuring out the rotation with tight end, I think, will be interesting. Mike Gesicki is going to be on the field. He's going to play in the slot a lot for this team. But Drew Sample just signed a 3-year extension. It's an interesting thing, right? They've always held Drew Sample in high esteem. He found his footing as a third down back last year. People are asking if he's going to play some fullback and some under center stuff and really take on that H-back role where he's lining up in line, he's lining up in the backfield and getting onto the field that way. Still not going to add a ton of dynamism as a wide receiver, right? Where he's shown some improvement in that area. I don't think that's what the Bengals are going to be asking to do all of a sudden, but finding how they deploy these tight ends, whether they do put Gesicki and Drew Sample on the field together more, what the rotation looks like at that position throughout training camp. And if we see them in the preseason, I think will be interesting in terms of the direction they're looking to go on offense. And speaking of the direction they're looking to go on offense, we know they're moving toward a running back by committee approach, but seeing exactly what the roles they've got planned for Zack Moss and Chase Brown will be throughout training camp and throughout the preseason is another piece of the puzzle that we will have answered in the next few weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And it's simple, really. I think it's going to be a 1-2 punch or a 1-1A, whatever you want to say. It's just a matter of how close to a 50-50 split is it? Is Chase Brown ready to go as a pass blocker? I think that will be a factor in it. He certainly feels ready to go as a receiver. We know what he is with the ball in his hands as an explosive athlete, explosive runner. And he was a bell cow running back at Illinois. And he's not going to have to do that here because you have a guy in Zack Moss who can do it all. I mean, he'll be able to pass protect for you. He'll be able to run between the tackles if you need him to. And so I think those are the two. And that's what's shaky is if one of those guys gets nicked up, who are you banking on? Maybe they're confident in Travion Williams to run the ball 8 to 10 times in any given week, or they believe that Chris Evans could take a step forward. But that's why we talk so much about running back pre-draft, just because I thought one of those picks, maybe one of those tight end picks, would be a running back, and they didn't go that route. And so maybe they'll sign one, but if they don't, I think it is going to be the Chase Brown, Zack Moss show, and it could be very, very close to a 50-50 split, which would be the first time we've seen a 50-50 split in quite some time here in Cincinnati.
Yeah, Cincinnati has been a traditional, we're going to have running backs that can carry the load kind of team in recent history. As far back as Ben Jarvis Green Ellis and Giovanni Bernard. There was a bit of a split there. Am I even remembering that correctly?
No, I think you're right. I think that's probably it. I mean,
like early Gio before they had Jeremy Hill.
Yeah, I mean, because Jeremy Hill came in and kind of became the bell cow guy, and then Hill and Mixon kind of were a weird tandem for a while there. And when Mixon was a rookie in 2017, but for the most part, you're right.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see how they use these guys, who they use in the passing game, in different roles in the passing game. If Zack Moss is a better pass protector, but Chase Brown is a more dynamic receiving running back, that will be interesting. The biggest thing they have to replace at the running back position is, in my opinion, Joe Mixon's ability as a receiving back. And so finding that ability somewhere, whether it's Chase Brown, whether it's a player not on the team, wherever they find it, I think is an important piece of this offense. Joe Burrow's confidence to check it down, and Joe Mixon's ability to make some plays with the ball in his hands as a receiver to keep the offense on schedule was an underrated part of this offense, I think, when they were going well in the last couple of years. And so finding that element is something that the Bengals will need to sort out between now and week 1 as well. And so that will be something we'll be watching. That wraps up the big storylines as far as I'm concerned on offense, James. There might be some college free agents that emerge and make themselves into stories on this offense. Cole Burgess, maybe one of the running backs. That will bear watching as well throughout camp. But let's switch gears tomorrow and put the spotlight on the defense, where I think there are a great deal of questions for a unit that really needs to bounce back after a tough year, especially in run defense, especially on the defensive interior. We'll break down all of those questions and stories to watch in training camp on the defensive side of the ball tomorrow. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.